Introducing the high-spined lizard, the Acrocanthosaurus. The prominent spinal ridge, for which it is named, supports a mass of muscle, helping it rip apart flesh and sinew alike. It is fearsome, naturally, but it's hard not to appreciate such an incredible animal. Oh, but if you're squeamish, watching it feed may spoil that appreciation a touch.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome an Albertosaurus to the park. To the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome an Atrociraptor to the park.
The baryonyx is well suited to different dietary sources, but just because an animal is adaptable doesn't make it invincible. Even this dinosaur needs a carefully planned environment, so make sure we give it an enclosure it can thrive in.
Now, much like me, the Brachiosaurus has a huge heart. Of course, this dinosaur needs it just to get blood to the very tip of its head and tail. Whereas, I'm just that nice a guy. Did I hear someone snicker back there?
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Compsognathus. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Coelophysis to the park. We are pleased to welcome a Chunkingsaurus to the park.
This animal is a classic predator. The Carnotaurus can move fast, has an excellent sense of smell, and is willing to sink its teeth into anything or anyone.
To the park. We are pleased to welcome a Chasmosaurus to the park.
Now here's a distinctive-looking dinosaur. The Corythosaurus has a bill like a duck and an impressive crest on its head. Kinda makes you wonder if evolution really does have a plan or if it's just trying everything until something sticks, huh? Now that I mention it, that might be exactly how evolution works. Huh.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Cryolophosaurus to the park. welcome a Dryosaurus to the park.
The Dreadnoughtus. This herbivore's name means fears nothing, and it's so big that I believe it.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Diplodocus to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Dinosaurus to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Dilophosaurus to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Deinonychus to the park.
When we talk about eye-catching species, the Dimetrodon and its remarkable spine sail is gonna be near the top. Some animals need your attention. This one demands it.
The Gallimimus is a sociable animal, but its speed is what stands out to me. The ranger teams are gonna have their work cut out for them.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome an Indoraptor to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome an Iguanodon to the park. gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome the Gigantspinosaurus to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome the Giganotosaurus to the park.
This efficient hunter is the Herrerasaurus. It's one of the most primitive theropods we know of. But primitive doesn't mean crude. It's well adapted for chasing down prey and biting down hard with those terrifying blade-like teeth. An amazing addition to this site.
Hierarchy of the strong is taking place here too.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a homolocephaly to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome Endominus Rex to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Kentrosaurus to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Microceratus to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Metriacanthosaurus to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Lokiceratops to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Lystrosaurus to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Maiasaura to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Majungasaurus to the park.
Ah, the Moros intrepidus. The word Moros comes from the ancient Greek spirit of impending doom. Rather morbid, I know, but it does paint a picture of what being confronted by this animal might feel like. I'm sure under your guidance, this dinosaur will prove a much cheerier addition to the site.
Some dinosaurs have a bias towards needing authority. The alpha tends to take that role. An organized group of dinosaurs can be a dangerous one, so we should keep an eye on this.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome an Oviraptor to the park.
The Ornithomimus, or bird mimic, has a remarkably large brain for its size. The areas dedicated to movement and coordination are especially well developed, fitting for a dinosaur that can reach such impressive speeds. It makes you wonder if bird brain is as savage an insult as some might think.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome an Allura Titan to the park. are pleased to welcome an Archipelago to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Pachycephalosaurus to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Parasaurolophus to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Patago Titan to the park.
If you were looking for a reason to be amazed by modern science, then look no further. The Proceratosaurus was identified from a very limited fossil record, and yet enough of its genome has been found to create this beautiful animal. It is a privilege to have this dinosaur here.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Psittacosaurus to the park.
This one feels like it's straight out of legend. Get this. A forest fire sweeps through southern France, and what's found in the aftermath? The first discovered remains of a pyroraptor. One heck of an origin story, right? And one heck of a dinosaur. Ooh, glad to have it with us.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Changosaurus to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome...
The strongest, most dominant animal in a pack tends to take the role of alpha, of leader. It seems that hierarchy of the strong is taking place here too.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Scorpius Rex to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Scrutiomimus to the park.
Stegosaurus might seem calm and docile, but there's no sense letting your guard down. If it's uncomfortable or provoked, it could do a lot of damage to our fences. Trust me on that.
This hybrid animal has a number of distinctive and iconic features of other dinosaurs. The Stegoceratops was designed and engineered to appeal to the masses, and oh boy, does it!
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Sinoceratops to the park.
The Spinoraptor is a predatory hybrid, synthesized from Spinosaurus and Velociraptor DNA. I've never dealt with an animal that seemed to want to hunt our guests quite as much as this one. My advice? Keep it locked down tight.
We are pleased to welcome a Spinosaurus to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Struthiomimus to the park. Triceratops to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Troodon to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Triceratops to the park.
The Stygimoloch is a gentle giant most of the time, until they're spooked at least. In the wild, that sort of defensive reaction keeps them and their herd safe. So try not to hold it against them if it's our fences that are on the receiving end of a charging Stygi.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Styracosaurus to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Suchomimus to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Therizinosaurus to the park. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Utah Raptor to the park. We are pleased to welcome a Tyrannis to the park.
Our scientists, and especially our PR team, will no doubt be delighted to have this dino in our collection. The Velociraptor is a real crowd pleaser. It's also among the cleverest of dinosaurs, so keep an eye on it. Seriously, because it is definitely keeping an eye on us. The Kayuajara, or as I like to market it, the Sky Shark, huh? Sure, I'm mainly saying that because of the impressive fin-like crest. And no, it doesn't have the uber predator habits of an actual shark, but look, just no one say false advertising and we'll be fine.
As dangerous in the air as it is on land, the Dimorphodon isn't too fussy about what's in its diet either. If that isn't incentive enough to treat this flying reptile with respect, I don't know what is. The Geosternbergia is an ancient pterosaur with an impressive cranial crest. Thanks to its size and surprising dexterity in the air, it's capable of causing some real damage if not carefully managed.
Strictly speaking, the Pteranodon isn't actually a dinosaur, but a prehistoric reptile, a flying reptile at that. Imagine the spectacle of these animals soaring through the skies. Well, I guess we don't need to imagine it since we've added them to our collection.
The largest flying animal we humans have ever discovered, the Quetzalcoatlus. Named after the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl, of course. Simply magnificent. These massive winged reptiles once dominated the skies. Now, we can see them doing the same again.
Ooh, the Tapejara! It's fun to say, it's even more fun to look at. The aerial color, that impressive sail behind its head. Yeah, this'll make even the most stone-hearted guest open up their wallet.
Asset for release.
Quite the impressive pterosaur. The Tropeognathus is most distinguished by its keel-tipped snout, which is easy to spot even from a distance. I'm sure our guests will love learning about and observing it. The incredible Attenboroughsaurus was named after naturalist and documentarian David Attenborough. It would be an honor having any prehistoric animal named after you, let alone this majestic reptile. This site has a celebrity in its midst.
Now that is one big fish, and the Dunkleosteus is armored like a tank too. Oh, and get this. Instead of teeth, it has 2 armored plates which can snap shut with more force than an Allosaurus bite. It's enough to make you never swim again. Not that I swam much before. The Ichthyosaurus is a prehistoric pelagic predator. Try saying that 3 times fast. Just consider this a kind of prehistoric dolphin. Although, don't expect wild swimming with Ichthyosaurus to be on anyone's bucket list, huh?
Named after Kronos, king of the Titans in Greek mythology. The Kronosaurus is a suitably titanic animal. This is a marine reptile that even a shark would think twice about confronting.
The megalodon has existed in every ocean in the world, but it tends to prefer warmer climates like a lot of other prehistoric animals. It's a truly dominant ocean predator. So, stay out of the water, unless you want to line up to be a hot lunch.
An ancient marine reptile, this one. Mosasaurus was the undisputed ruler of the seas in its time. And well, now, it's an apex predator in ours, too. When this animal is around, you don't ever go into the water.
This is the Plesiosaurus, a marine reptile that, like modern-day sea mammals, comes up for air. It can really move in the water, and has a big appetite, so don't dangle your feet in the pool around this one,